I always start my mastering sessions off by programming the multiband compressor first, but before I can start to use the multiband compressor, I better disable all of my other plugins except for the scope. So I'm going to bypass all of the insert effects except for insert number 6, which is the multiscope, and obviously the multiband compressor, which I'm going to program now. So I'm going to hit the E button, which will call up the control panel for the multiband compressor, and I'm going to hit the E button on the multiscope so that I can see the frequency analysis of the output of Cubase, and I can monitor what's actually happening throughout the audio spectrum whenever I start to program the multiband compressor. So I'm going to rewind my project all the way back to the beginning, and I'm going to start this Cubase project from the very beginning, and I'm going to start to program the multiband compressor. Now, your mileage and my mileage at this point are going to vary dramatically because we're not working on the same project anymore. You're working on yours, and I'm working on mine, but by watching the techniques that I use and the approach that I take to mastering, you'll be able to make a great sounding master on your projects as well. So let's talk about the multiband compressor here. I'm going to turn up the output of my song here so that I can hear a little bit more of it. And the first thing that I'll want to do is turn off all of the frequency bands except for the low frequencies. So I'm going to hit the bypass button on these other compressors, and I'm only going to worry about the low end right now. Typically on the low end, I'll have the low end compression, especially on a project that has a real drum set, down to about 75 to 80 hertz. So I'm going to drag that frequency bandwidth down to about 75 hertz. And then I'm going to solo it so I can just hear the extreme low frequencies. And by using the multiscope, I can kind of see how much signal there already is in the low frequency band. And in listening to it, I'm going to maybe have the threshold engage at about 18 dB below zero with about 3:1 compression ratio. Let me unsolo that and listen to the result of that low-end compressor. I can bypass it, and I can hear that it's not quite as thick as it is with the compressor on. It's not as punchy. So I like what that compressor's doing, but it's also made it a little tiny bit softer, so I'm going to turn the makeup gain on that frequency band up a little tiny bit. Now I've got a nice rich sounding low end. Now for the low mids, typically I'll have the low mids work from 80 hertz up to about 800 hertz. And I'm going to enable that compressor. Then I'll hit the solo button, and I can hear that the frequencies that are in that frequency band are things like the definition of the low frequency part of the stick, and also the drums, the fundamental tone of things like the tom-toms and the upper frequencies of the bass drum. And now there's a bass solo, so a lot of the fundamental frequencies of the bass are in that frequency band too. What happens if I change the frequency band? You can hear that there are more frequencies being included in that frequency band. And actually, I like some of that bass guitar that's in there, so I'm going to raise the amount of frequency bandwidth from 800 hertz to around 2.2 kilohertz. Now I'm going to adjust the compression in that frequency bandwidth to maybe start at about 20 dB below zero and 2:1 compression ratio. Let's hear it before and after. You can hear that that bass guitar starts to get squishier, it starts to get more compressed, and you can see that the compressor is working harder now, so it's pulling some of that volume away. So that's probably a little bit too much compression on that frequency band. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise the threshold of that compressor up to about -15, or maybe even -12. Let's hear that result. This is before. And this is after. And actually, I think I will have the compressor start a little bit earlier, so I'm going to raise that threshold, actually lower the threshold, because we're talking about negative numbers, back down to about -15 where we started. Now let's worry about the high mid frequencies. So I'm going to enable that compressor, and I'm going to solo it and hear about what sort of frequencies are in that frequency band and determine what instruments are in there. And it's pretty narrow to start with. It's actually pretty wide to start with, so I'm going to lower it down to about maybe around 10,000 hertz. And what I'm hearing in there are the snappy parts of the snare drum, the very, very high frequencies in the theremin, and also some of the high frequencies of the stick. So this is a very, very important frequency band because this is where a lot of the upper end harmonics from the lower pitched instruments come from. So I don't want to diminish this frequency band at all. I want to make sure that it's nicely compressed and has a lot of definition. So I'm going to actually have it start compressing at a fairly low volume, maybe around 22 dB below zero, and maybe around 3 or even 3.5 to 1 compression ratio. And my project is just about to finish here, so I'm going to start the project over again. There we go. And now, that's pulling quite a bit of volume away. Let's hear it in context by unsoloing it. And I can look over the multiscope and I can actually see that there isn't a lot of frequencies happening in that all-important high mid-range band. And I can see that the compressor is pulling quite a bit of that volume away. So I'm going to raise the makeup gain on that frequency band. And so that it's not working so hard, I'm going to bring the compression ratio down to about 3 dB. So 3-to-1 compression ratio. And now you can see I've evened out that frequency bandwidth, and I'm getting a much more even response in that frequency range because of it. And so I can hear the definition of a lot of those instruments. Now let's worry about the extreme high frequency band. I'm going to bypass that band and solo it, and take a listen to it, and you can actually hear that there are only a few things happening in that frequency band, just the very, very crispy parts of the hi-hat. So I probably don't need to do a lot to this frequency band, except that there are upper-end harmonics in this as well. So I'm not going to compress it very hard. In fact, the compressor right now isn't doing anything. There's nothing happening on the gain reduction meter of the high frequency band, so it's not doing anything. Let's go ahead and lower the compression amount down to a point where we start to see it work. And now you can see that it's working at -26 dB below zero. That compressor is actually working. But I don't want it to work that hard, so I'm going to raise the threshold a bit, just so that it's only working whenever there's a fairly crispy, loud part of high frequencies coming through that compressor, and leave the ratio at 2-to-1. Now I'm going to unsolo that band so I can hear it in context and hear the result. Now you may have already noticed that we have raised some of the makeup gain, and therefore we're starting to overdrive the output of the compressor. It's already gone up to positive 1.4 dB above zero. So I'll want to lower the output of that plugin by -1.5 dB. And then I'll reset the clip indicator by clicking on it. And then we'll start to take a listen to our multiband compression results. Now for me, I'm not hearing enough of this frequency bandwidth, so I'm going to bring some of those low mids up a little bit, and at the same time, I'm going to de-emphasize some of that high mid-frequency bandwidth. Things are sounding pretty good, but what did they sound like before and after? Well, that's when we use the bypass button to hear the results of the before and after. So Here's our project before the multiband compressor. And after. Now I'm hearing a lot of cymbals. Where are all of those cymbals? Well, most of them are in that high mid-frequency band, and some of them are in the very high frequency band. But boy, I sure like how everything else sounds. Those cymbals might become a problem a little bit later, but I like what that multiband compressor is doing. Let's do some before and after again. This is before. And after. That low end is thicker, and it's richer, and it's punchier, and there's a lot more definition in the mid-range. So I like the compressor settings that we have right now. So let's go ahead and leave those alone, even though I feel like the cymbals are a little bit loud. And we could either fix that in the mix, or we could use the graphic equalizer to control the frequencies that are more centralized around the fundamental frequency of those cymbals. So let's talk about equalization or tone control next.